As the 10th anniversary of the Five Nights at Freddy series inches closer and closer, I begin to feel nostalgic for it. While I haven't been a fan or associated with the series in years, it's definitely a series that I have a soft spot for. So in this retrospective, I want to share my thoughts about each game in the series, as well as my history with it personally. With that being said, here's my Five Nights at Freddy's retrospective. So first we have to step back to August of 2014. It's weird to think about, but I've been with the FNaF series since the very beginning. And that first game forever had an impact on the video game landscape as we know it today. In my opinion, it's still the best game of the entire franchise because of how simple yet effective it is on almost every level. I remember vividly in August 2014, I was still in middle school and everyone was talking about it and just how scary it was. Even though conversation about the game died quickly, those first couple weeks of school, everyone was talking about it. By then, the first mobile port of the game released, and that's mostly how everyone played it. That's actually how I got introduced to the game. I remember clear as day, someone on the bus sat next to me and asked if I had played it yet. And I didn't. I said no, and right after he gave me his phone and let me try the first game. He didn't tell me how to play or what I was supposed to do, and because of that I was just so confused, and up until then I hadn't really seen anything about the game, so he immediately took his phone back. But later on, I downloaded the demo for myself, and even on my shitty tablet with no headphones plugged in, the first game terrified me. Eventually though, I got the game on my computer and had the full experience of that first game. And seriously, for weeks, I was just obsessed with this one game. I mean, honestly, it took me days to beat later nights, especially when Freddy was introduced, since I always struggled dealing with him. And even though I wasn't one of those true gamers that beat 420 mode, I don't care. It was just really hard. What do you want me to say? When talking about the game's story, it's hard not to mention later aspects of the story, but the original lore of the first game was so compelling and interesting, the series really did peak with the beginning in my opinion. Sure, we all know the story now, but back then, it was just a night security guard watching cameras, keeping tabs on the animatronic characters that were also trying to kill him. But throughout the game, you'd find things such as newspaper clippings hinting at a more deeper story going on here. And even just those newspaper clippings of the missing children's incident was compelling enough. The story and lore of this game was so simple, and it leaves a lot of mysteries for the player, and it leaves a lot of room to come to conclusions on your own. And any conclusion that the player could have come to with these hints for them were completely fair and made total sense. The game tells you just enough while also leaving enough mysteries for you to stay interested in the story. For example, it's never made crystal clear that the killer worked at the pizzeria. It's never made clear what suit he used to lure the kids with. While the newspaper clippings say the killer was caught, does that even really mean anything? Sure, you're told you play as a man named Mike Schmidt, but is it possible you're working as the killer and that's why the animatronics are coming after you? All these questions are reasonable things to wonder, and all of them have reasonable answers you can come with fairly reasonable conclusions to. However, as we move forward in the series, the simplicity of the story is quickly thrown out the window, unfortunately. While I'd say it remained fairly simple, at a certain point it kind of just goes off the wall, and that's kind of when it becomes less interesting. The gameplay of this first game is also just ingenious. You only have one task really, which is just to keep the animatronics out. You may have multiple ways to do this, such as checking the cameras, lights outside your office, and of course closing the door on them, but it's all one goal. The game is probably the most visually appealing of the series as well, at least in terms of the aesthetic. The graphics aren't anything mind-blowing, truth be told, but the game holds up super well even after 8 years. Honestly, I could keep going on about this game, and I might eventually in the future, but I'm just going to keep it here, because there's a lot to go over still. Overall, FNaF 1 is truly a great game, and the series' popularity is all thanks to this game. So before I talk about the second game, I just want to take a minute to talk about the infamous teasers on Scott Games. They all started with the classic reopening teaser for the second game, and honestly, this is still probably my favorite teaser. There are some really great and classic ones, but I don't know, this one was just so instrumental for teasers becoming a staple. I mean, quite literally everyone talked about it when this came out. So I'm not going to go on a super long tangent about the teasers for the series. I just wanted to bring up this one since I feel it's relevant. FNaF 2 is probably my personal favorite of the series. While FNaF 1 is actually the best, and I often go back and forth between FNaF 1 and FNaF 2 being my favorite, I always look back on this game the most fondly. I always liked how colorful the game was in both the environments and the characters, specifically all the new characters. This might be a controversial take, but I love the toy animatronic designs. While they definitely aren't the scariest or best designed animatronics, I just love their designs. The smooth plastic, kind of segmented aesthetic just works for me. I don't know why. Also, I'm just gonna say it now, Toy Chica is the best Chica design of the series. And no, it's not for the reasons you'd think. FNaF 1 Chica always looked like a duck and was generally just an ugly design in my opinion. And I get that's the point, but she was just always kind of weird looking, I don't know. Meanwhile, Toy Chica actually looked like a chicken and isn't totally ugly. Toy Bonnie for a long time was my favorite Bonnie design, but after years of thinking about it, I think I prefer the FNaF 1 Bonnie.
Number 8 is that Toy Freddy, well, you know, he's kinda, fat. I mean, come on, come on, what can I say? He's gained a few pounds. I mean, look at him compared to the other animatronics on the show stage. He's, rounder, more big-boned, ate a little bit too much pizza. You know what I mean? Just because it's called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza doesn't mean you gotta eat all of it, you know what I mean?
This game also has the withered animatronics, which are so amazingly designed. While I personally prefer the designs of the FNaF 1 animatronics, these are undeniably some of the best designs of the series. Everyone says Withered Freddy is the best, but I'm Withered Bonnie gang all the way. Sorry, not sorry, I guess. This is the game that really added more to the lore of the series with the addition of the Atari-style death minigames. Personally, I preferred the more vague yet pretty straightforward lore of the first game. I think this game adds to the lore in a good way. One thing that I'm still to this day not sure about how I feel though is the addition of 2 other pizzerias besides the in-game ones. To summarize the timeline at the time of FNaF 2, there was the original Fredbear's Family Diner, as mentioned by the phone guy in the second game. Then there was a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza before the one in FNaF 2. Then there's a FNaF 2 location, and then there's a FNaF 1 location. I always thought that because there was another Freddy Fazbear's Pizza before the one in FNaF 2, it always kind of complicated things for no reason. Because we don't find out until the end of the game that this is a prequel, so the whole time you think it's the first game that Phone Guy's talking about, but he's really just talking about a location that we've never seen. It also is only there to explain why we have the withered animatronics, because this is a prequel, they're not from the first game. The first game didn't happen yet. But then also just having Fredbear's Diner in there, that was just weird, and I've grown to appreciate it and like it over the years, but it's just kind of weird to add in the second game. It also made the missing children, number count a little confusing, maybe just for me, but we know there was 5 that went missing. It had to be at that first location, but then in the mini games, there's also 5 more that died at the FNaF 2 location, so there's 10 kids that died. Not to mention the one that dies outside of a pizzeria in one of the death mini games. So I guess there's 11 dead kids, which makes sense because there's 11 animatronics in FNaF 2, but I don't think the toy animatronics were possessed. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I never thought they were possessed, so I'm not sure. All of these little things, I feel like this game should have just been a straight sequel to the first game. It wouldn't have to explain how there's the withered animatronics here. There wouldn't have to be Freddy Fazbear's Pizza before the FNaF 2 one. There'd still be Fredbear's, but that would just be the first one. Not to mention, then you would just be left with 5 kids that died instead of possibly 11 or even more at this point. But besides all that, the last thing about the lore is the way that this game introduced the purple guy, or as we know him now, William Afton. Does anyone else remember the fan name Vincent, by the way? I'm not sure it was Vincent specifically, but I don't know, I guess it just sounded cool. Also, rip to the theory that purple guy was phone guy. I still wonder what the hell was in his hand in this iconic sprite. It's honestly a little sad that the other sprite in the Foxy Go 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 minigame and the Give Cake minigame was never really popular, but I get why the other one is. But now we actually finally do have a killer established in the series, and we we see it happen. So it's cool that we finally have a character that represents the killer. It's just cool. I don't know. Okay, so finally there's the gameplay, and obviously, first thing to point out, this game ditched the doors, and they didn't come back until FNaF 4. To replace the door mechanic, Scott introduced the mask mechanic, and I personally like it. It's a nice spin on the gameplay loop, and is a fine replacement for the doors in my opinion. Just like FNaF 1, the cameras are great, but are definitely underutilized. In the first game it had this problem too, where you really only needed the camera on Foxy, and this game, as you know, you only need the camera on the prize corner to wind up the puppet's music box. And the music box is a somewhat frustrating mechanic because in theory it's not a bad idea, but in execution, you'll never have a reason to leave that camera. That's not to say it's not hard trying to keep up with it on later nights, as your hands will be full with everything else going on in the office, but if there was a reason to check the other cameras, it definitely would have made things more interesting and difficult. I think the flashlight is a great idea, but again, it kind of gets repetitive. You'll basically never have a reason to just not constantly flash the hallway, since it's both a good way to quickly check who's in the hallway, but it's also the only way to get rid of Withered Foxy, for example. Lastly, I just want to touch on the graphics for a second, because while I think they're an improvement on the first game, especially the cameras, I think the first game's graphics just hold up better today. I think that small scale nature of the first game will always make it so that it's the one FNaF game that will hold up the best in 20 years. And it's definitely not a jab at this game, nor other future games. Otherwise, that's really it for FNaF 2. While the first game was a classic and can definitely stand on its own, this was the game that made it a series and was a great introduction to the deeper lore in the series. Okay, another break here. Get used to it after every game. This time I want to talk about something that's really not a big deal, but is definitely something that makes the first game hold up even more so. So one thing that FNaF 2 made a standard of the series was all the games having a 4:3 ratio. While I think it kind of works in FNaF 2 because of its setting in the 80s, I think it would actually end up hurting it in the future games that were in 4:3. Widescreen just looks better, but since FNaF 2 through 4 were made with the intended aspect ratio being 4:3, it makes them look horribly stretched when it's 16:9. I have them all in 6:9 in this video, and it's really just for consistency, but I definitely do prefer the look of 4:3 and wish they looked better in 16:9. So I definitely wish they were all made with the 16:9 aspect ratio in mind, but I guess it is what it is now. FNaF 3 was probably the most interesting release of the original Scott Cawthon series of games in terms of fan reaction. Right from the beginning, there were just so many questions about what this game was going to be, both in gameplay and the lore departments. Many people suspected the game would be free roam, but this never clearly happened, nor was ever even considered. In fact, I'm not sure what made people think this other than just their hopes that it would be free roam. Then there was the lore. From the teasers before release, we knew the game would take place about 30 years in the future. Whether it was 30 years after FNaF 1 or 2, it was unclear, but it kind of didn't matter since this was a huge time jump. The largest time jump in the series before was only from 1987 to presumably sometime in the 90s. We also knew of one confirmed animatronic, that being Springtrap, or as a lot of people called him back then, Salvage, before we knew his real name. There's that infamous teaser of all the toy animatronic parts in a box, and I gotta say, that was probably one of the worst teasers of Scott Games' history. It honestly led a lot of people on to suspecting that there would be returning animatronics from previous games, or that there would be a hybrid of all the animatronics. But of course now we know that it never happened, and this box was literally just a prop in the office. But then eventually the game came out, and God, was this game divisive. Many people enjoyed the story, and it seemingly concluded the story, but the gameplay was heavily critiqued for being boring, uninteresting, not scary, and just not very fun. So far I've been talking about the lore before the gameplay, but this time I actually want to talk about the gameplay first, since it's most important to me. The gameplay is definitely a step down from the previous entries. While the first two games were always active and pretty chaotic at points, FNaF 3 doesn't have a whole lot of moving parts. The main goal is to keep Springtrap away from your office by alluring him with audio, but after a certain amount of time, things will start failing, and eventually phantom animatronics will jump scare you and mess with things such as your video feed, audio, and ventilation. So the things such as the video feed and the audio feed are super important because the audio keeps Springtrap away and you need to be able to see the cameras to know where he is and where he's going to go. The ventilation system kind of seems tacked on at first, since all it does is fade the screen to black, which is basically the same as the video feed going out, since you don't really ever need to see the office as long as you can see the cameras. However, I honestly can't really hate it, since it's just another level of difficulty dealing with it. Having to go back and forth to each end of the office constantly to check cameras and to fix systems that go offline is a double-edged sword, honestly. While it makes it so the player can't just stay in one spot and to win, it is incredibly boring and monotonous. I know in the other two games you have to go back and forth in the office, but there was always a reason to, and there was always bound to be something there. I'm trying to be as positive as I can with the gameplay, but honestly just can't even beat around the bush anymore. FNaF 3, in my opinion, has the worst gameplay out of the entire series. It's just boring, uninteresting, and quite frankly feels lazy on behalf of Scott. I give him a lot of credit for trying to do something new since we've already had 3 games at this point, but it feels like he put story first and gameplay second. I'm a firm believer in prioritizing gameplay over story, and FNaF 3 just fumbled the ball in that area for me. But even though I might not like the gameplay, the story and lore of this game is when the series really got deep with it. Since the FNaF series was intended to be a trilogy, this was, at the time, the final chapter of the story we've been told until then. I think the good and bad endings are a nice addition to the series, and having the player get the bad ending on their first playthrough encourages you to go back and get the good ending. And really, going back and doing all the weird shit you had to do to get the good ending really does pay off. Between the Happiest Day minigame, the death of the purple guy, and everything going up in flames at the end, it would have made the perfect end to the series, and honestly, to this day, I wish the series just ended with FNaF 3. Were there some questions left still unanswered? Sure, but the biggest plot points were wrapped up, and the whole story comes to an end with the death of Springtrap and the burning of Fazbear Fright. At least that's what I would say if it wasn't so heavily implied that Springtrap survived the fire, and obviously looking back 7 games coming after this, yeah, it kind of deflates this game's ending for me. And the death of the purple guy was the first giant reveal of the series had, and the second best reveal of the franchise, in my opinion. I'll talk about who's first later, don't worry. Overall, FNaF 3 is a curious one. While I think the gameplay falls short, the lore and endings really help it stand up, and for sure delivers a satisfying ending to the series. FNaF 4 was the first game where we really had a good idea of what the story was going to be before it came out. We also knew when it was going to take place on the timeline, or at least we had a good idea we did. Based on the teasers, we kind of guessed it would take place during the pivotal time before FNaF 2, during either Fredbear's or the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And sure enough, we actually got that right, as it's the earliest game in the timeline. As I previously mentioned, FNaF 4 was made due to the poor response from the fans and critics about FNaF 3. While FNaF 3 delivered on the story, the gameplay was lackluster. So now Scott went full speed ahead, making the game scary and filled to the brim with story and lore, both wrapping up some loose threads, but mainly adding more to the story than we initially thought we knew. This is also the first FNaF game to really have a main protagonist. While FNaF 1 through 3 had the player playing as security guards with names, even though FNaF 3 didn't have a name, they weren't really characters. FNaF 4, on the other hand, has the crying child. While it's debated now whether he's Michael Afton or some other Afton child, at the time we didn't have any of that information, and honestly I'm not going to cover that here. Although if you want to know what I think, I personally don't believe it's Michael Afton, but that's for another day. In between each night you play as the crying child, and he gets relentlessly bullied by his older brother at home. You find out that this boy is terrified of the animatronics, yet not his plush toys of the FNaF 1 cast. While it's not clear why he's so scared, there are a couple different factors/theories. The 2 main ones presented in the game are a combination of his older brother scaring him with the Foxy mask, and the purple guy Easter egg in the restaurant. On night 2 you can witness purple guy putting the spring Bonnie head on someone in a suit. While this could look like someone getting stuffed into a suit, what is seen in the shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child. Between all these different things, you really feel bad for the kid in FNaF 4. These minigame segments also give us a date on the TV in the crying child's living room, that being 1983. Now, while it's never been straight up confirmed that FNaF 4 takes place in 1983, as that date could just be a copyright year for Fredbear and Friends, this year detail is important because of the ending of the game. That ending being the crying child getting thrown inside Fredbear's mouth by his older brother, getting crushed. When the game first released, many people suspected this was the bite of 87. I mean, it just made sense to think that. We've only ever heard of one bite up until then, and at the time of release, we didn't know about that 1983 Easter egg on the TV. However, once that detail did come out later on, it sparked a fierce debate as to what year this game really took place in, and if the bite witnessed in this game was the bite of 87 or the bite of 83. And while we know now that this was the bite of 83, in my opinion, this is one of the biggest mistakes the series ever made. The game could have finally showed one of the most talked about, mysterious moments of the entire franchise, and the fact that this wasn't that, and instead just another bite that happened 4 years prior, kind of deflates the impact and the legacy of the bite of 87. I mean, just think about it. Nowadays, the bite of 83 is one of the most pivotal moments of the series. Meanwhile, the bite of 87 is kind of just written off as possibly happening to an employee at the FNaF 2 location that led to the animatronics not being allowed to walk during the day. This could have been a huge moment that ties back to the very first game, but instead was its own new thing, and it kind of just deflated the entire mystery of the bite of 87. It's also frustrating because this was pushed as the final game in the series. I mean, it's literally called the final chapter. So when FNaF 3 finally started giving us definitive answers, and with FNaF 4 marked as the final chapter, it was safe to assume we'd get even more answers in this game. So to finally get a reveal for one of FNaF's biggest mysteries, only for it to be an entirely different event that raises so many new questions, it was and still is frustrating if I'm being honest. This kind of signifies to me that this was never planned to be the final game of the series, which sucks because it was labeled as the final chapter. I think if the series was ended and rebooted with sister location, it would have been perfectly fine. But, I mean, I'm one of those people who thinks the series should have ended with FNaF 3, but I'm okay with an ending after 4 if it was a true ending. But it's kind of not a true ending to the series because it doesn't really answer a whole ton of questions. So my final thoughts on the lore is that I appreciate the amount of work that went into it, but am disappointed that the bite of 83 took center stage over the bite of 87. Also, I'm not sure if this has changed after the years since Ultimate Custom Night, but it's also kind of disappointing that the crying child never became a character like Golden Freddy or the puppet. I know who the puppet is now, but at the time, that was still a mystery. I mean, there was a debate about if this crying child became the puppet or Golden Freddy, and I think a lot of people landed on Golden Freddy, but later on we find out that Golden Freddy was just someone that we've never seen before. I guess it would have made things complicated later on if Golden Freddy was the crying child, who was also one of William Afton's children, but you also didn't need to make the crying child a member of the Afton family. Alright, so after all that, let's finally talk about the gameplay. So the mechanics are essentially the same as the first game, where you check doors on opposite side of the room with a light, and if there's someone there, shut the door. The difference here though is that this time it's all about the audio aspect. The other games mostly relied on visuals, or very rarely used audio to a great effect. The only couple times I can think of where audio was used was Foxy banging on the door in FNaF 1 to let you know when he's gone, Chica banging about in the kitchen in FNaF 1 letting you know she's there, and the sound of an animatronic in the vents of FNaF 2. The thing was, those were all things that you could either check visually or just didn't matter. You can check Pirate's Cove to see if Foxy went back, and chances are the camera was already on Pirate's Cove. You can check the lights in the vents or the cameras to see who's in the vents. And Chica in the kitchen literally means nothing since that's not near your office. Though I suppose it could signal that she is on the way. The thing about FNaF 4 is that in order to check if an animatronic is at the door, you have to listen for their breathing. Normally flashing your light down the hallway will send them back. However, if they're right at the door, you die. Honestly, this is such a genius move because the game itself becomes way more scarier because of this audio aspect. You have to have the volume up super high in order to hear everything, so when you get jump scared, you really feel it. This alone makes it the most tense game of the entire series in my opinion. Also, the designs of the characters are all great. While people kind of meme on them these days for being overly designed, I personally don't mind it, and I think they look kind of awesome. The jump scares themselves are also just super aggressive, and combining the scariness of the designs with the intense jump scares make this game so scary. And this game can get hard too. Like, honestly, for me, it's probably the second hardest in the series. I'd probably put FNaF 2 as the hardest game, but honestly, I go back and forth between it all the time. I was actually only able to beat the main 5 nights in this game, and just barely too. The setting being a child's bedroom is also just a fresh take on the setting, and it makes it much more scarier. I will say though, it doesn't quite nail down the claustrophobic feeling of the first game, but the fact that it's a bedroom with practically zero ways of escape or hiding is terrifying by itself. It's also really cool to finally see Fredbear, or at least a form of him in Nightmare Fredbear. We've heard about him since FNaF 2, and it was especially cool that he was essentially the final boss of this game. Not to mention, he has the best design of all the nightmares, hands down. Overall, while I have some problems with the lore, it's a pretty solid ending to the series, and it does have some of the best gameplay. So I probably should have mentioned this in the FNaF 3 part, but it kind of seems more appropriate to bring it up here. FNaF 3 introduced the extras menu, and FNaF 4 and Sister Location continued this idea. I don't really have a lot to say about it, besides the fact that it's just really cool, and I'm glad it was implemented on in later games. It would have been awesome if the older games got updated with their own extras menu, but I guess it's not the end of the world, since it didn't happen. It would have been neat to see on the console editions though, even if they were the shitty Help Wanted models. Alright. I hear a ton of you getting ready to yell at me for talking about FNaF World, but hear me out. While it's not part of the main series of game, and is definitely its own thing, FNaF World is just such a special game to me, I can't not talk about it. FNaF World is such a strange release because it's one most people either dislike or forget about. Hell, I'm sure a lot of new fans don't even know about it. I mean, Scott himself doesn't even like the game. And you know what? I don't care what anyone says, I really like this game. I remember me and my friends all started the game at the same time, and we're all racing to get the characters. The way it works is that you will encounter a character on the overworld and have to beat them in battle for them to join your party. So that's why we were all kind of trying to race to get all the characters, but you know, it's kind of hard when you just kind of fight them randomly. But I remember at one point we were all looking for Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, and I was the first one to encounter Spring Bonnie. And even though the first encounter I had with him I lost pretty terribly actually, I think I eventually was the first one to unlock him later on, and my god, it was so satisfying for some reason. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about FNaF World since there honestly isn't much in terms of gameplay or story. I'll just say there really isn't a story or lore for the rest of the games. People speculate about it, and Scott has even said he's tried to tie it in with the rest of the games. But I'm just going to completely ignore anything FNaF World may have to do with the rest of the series since I don't see it as important. The actual story of this game is just kind of cute, stopping Scott Cawthon himself and freeing everyone from his control. It's silly, and I've always taken it lightheartedly. The gameplay is pretty basic RPG style gameplay. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge RPG guy, so I'm not sure how this fares as an RPG specifically, but I like it. It's simple, but it can actually get complex, and you have to really think quick at some points. What I really want to talk about is just all the character designs in this game. Not sure how people feel about them these days, but I've always loved the art style for this game. I don't know, I just kind of love the chibi designs for the animatronics, and I'm not usually a huge chibi art style enjoyer. Every single character here is just quality, and I generally don't think there is a single bad design here. All the enemies are unique and different, yet fitting for the style and the FNaF series. I really loved Update 2.0, which added the most OP characters in the game. It also gave love to characters like Jacko Bonnie and Jacko Chica, which are characters that are so underrated it kinda hurts. We also got to see the return of Chipper as both a boss as well as a playable character. This game was the first time we really got to see Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, as well as a pre-destroyed Mangle, who was called Funtime Foxy, believe it or not. Yeah, the name Funtime Foxy got its origin from FNaF World and not Sister Location, go figure. One thing I want to touch on is the initial Steam release of the game. Initially it released on Steam for $10 and had a completely different Atari-styled overworld. Because of the bad reviews and his own shame, Scott removed the game from Steam, refunded everybody who bought it, and eventually listed it on Game Show for free, with a completely rehauled overworld and other minor changes and fixes. I think this whole thing really just humbled Scott and showed that he was really loyal to the fan base and had pride in what he released. And he went out of his way, and at great personal cost to him, made things right with the fans. So to me at least, that truly shows the sign of a great game developer and person. Anyways, yeah, FNaF World. It happened. I liked it. Moving on. Alright, so I have a confession to make. I've actually never played Sister Location. I know, I'm a fraud, but let me explain myself. The first 4 games, I only ever got them after they were out for about a week. Don't ask me why, but that's just how it was, especially since I was a kid and didn't have my own money to buy them when I wanted to. However, when Sister Location came out, I watched Markiplier play it and saw the theories and lore, and kind of just decided I didn't want to play it. Not to mention, if you watch a Let's Play before you play it, you've kind of already played it, because you can't really have your own experience with this game, unlike the other games. Now, I know there's been a recent upsurge of people saying that they don't like Sister Location thanks to a popular YouTube video, so I don't want to jump on the bandwagon, but man, looking back in hindsight, Sister Location was not as good as I thought it was. Now, obviously I can't talk about the gameplay since I never played the game, however, I have a lot of thoughts about the story and lore this game introduces. So the elephant in the room that's standing right at the door as you walk in is the reveal of Purple Guy's name, William Afton. The reveal actually came from the Silver Eyes book first, but this was the first game to actually give him a name. This is also the first game with voice acting, so that's fun. Everyone does a really great job too, with the standout being Heather Masters' Baby. Unfortunately though, while Baby is positioned as the main character, she literally has 1 appearance in this game. Yeah, only 1 appearance in the game about her. She was in most of the game's teasers and was very obviously the center point in the trailer. But Baby is so underutilized in this game, it's honestly kind of depressing, especially since she has one of the best designs of the series. For some reason on the Steam page is Funtime Freddy on the game's art, which is super bizarre. Real quick, I want to talk about the designs of the animatronics. I think they're all designed super well, especially Baby and the 2 Funtime characters. However, they never really made sense to me. Like, I get why they have faceplates to make them scarier, and it works, and it looks way better than if they weren't. But I don't think they really serve a purpose in universe. Like, maybe they do, and I'm just stupid, and I just don't know. But it kind of takes away from the realism. And that's actually a huge problem I have with this game in general. It strips away a lot of the realism, and more importantly, the simplicity the series had. Now, don't get me wrong, Dead Kids haunting pizzeria animatronics isn't super realistic, and the series had become somewhat confusing at this point, but the way I see it, the premise of the whole franchise was grounded in reality, and was relatively simple. There's a murderer. That murderer kills kids. Those kids haunt animatronic characters. What Sister Location does is make it a story about one specific family, which is the killer and his family, and throws it in the super sci-fi looking underground bunker with animatronic robots that would have been impossible to build in the 80s. Don't get me wrong, I do like a lot about this game, trust me, but the lack of Baby and the lack of consistency with the other games are huge problems for me. While I wish the focus on these games didn't lean so heavily on the Aftons, I cannot deny that the ending of this game and the custom night are awesome. We play as Michael Afton throughout the game, and the goal of the animatronics is to use his body as a skin suit pretty much. And they actually succeed in the canon ending. The ending reveals a newly formed Ennard has escaped with the new suit that is Michael Afton. Ending it right here would have been perfectly fine, but the ending to Custom Night makes it way better. As Michael Afton leaves the bunker each night, his body slowly starts to decay, leaving it too weak and rotted, and purple, to be used by Ennard anymore. Ennard gets spit out and Michael's dead body collapses to the ground, only for him to possess his own body in return. The final monologue ending with Michael threatening to find his father, only to finally confirm that Springtrap survived the fire, is just awesome. And while it does leave on such a cliffhanger, Scott kinda had to follow this up, I honestly don't care. It's an amazing ending. So that's really all I have to say about Sister Location. I never played it, and would only honestly ever play it if I ever got the console edition bundle or something. The story has some great moments, but the way it shakes up the entire timeline of what we thought before, I'm not a fan of. Okay, so I thought about making the books its own section, but since I've only read the first 2 and there's like a million at this point, I'm just going to talk about them here. So specifically, I'm talking about the Silver Eyes, the Twisted Ones, and I guess the Fourth Closet. Silver Eyes came out between FNaF 4 and FNaF World, I believe, and I thought that it was a great first book for the series. It's a brand new story with new characters, but that take place in the FNaF 1 location with the FNaF 1 animatronics. And I really loved a lot of the characters in this book. To be honest though, the only character whose name I can remember is Charlie though. As I mentioned earlier, this book was the reveal of William Afton, who in the books is the co-CEO of Fazbear Entertainment with a character also introduced named Henry, who is Charlie's father. Henry was the one who created the animatronics, while William was the business guy. Both of these characters are now in the games, however it's very important to establish that the books and the games are two different canons. Like, elements cross over between the two, but they are indeed two different canons and timelines. For example, William Afton and Henry aren't in both, but they seem to have different roles in both. While in the books, Henry makes the animatronics, and the games very much establishes that William Afton creates the animatronics. And even though I wouldn't be surprised if Henry was the business end of the company, I don't know for sure. The Twisted Ones I remember really liking when I read it, but honestly cannot remember a single thing from it other than it was implied Charlie died at the end. Hey, editing me here, so I actually went back and looked at this after I wrote the script for this, and yeah, Charlie definitely did die in the book, and it was implied that there was a fake Charlie at the end, so I got that a little wrong, but oh well. And I did not read The Fourth Closet, and based off of what I've heard, such as Charlie being a robot the whole time, I'm very glad I didn't. But yeah, just wanted to mention the books here because it kind of just makes sense to do it now and not give it its own segment. They are also very important for the last few games of the series, so it's fitting to bring it up now. Okay, so I'm just going to say from Sister Location on, I didn't really play any of the games. Well, I technically have Pizzeria Simulator downloaded, and as well as Ultimate Custom Night, I never actually tried to play them. I kind of just messed around with them, but didn't actually play them for real, if that makes sense. So unfortunately, there will be no gameplay portion here either. However, story in this game is probably the most important in series history, as it's the actual final ending. There's so much to talk about that I'm honestly not even sure where to start. Okay, so do you remember how I said earlier that the death of the purple guy and the reveal he is actually Springtrap was the second best reveal from a minigame? Well, I saved the best reveal for now, and it's a huge reveal and confirmation for all FNaF fans. The reveal is that Henry's daughter is the puppet, and more importantly, she was a child murdered outside the Give Cakes FNaF 2 minigame. And at the time, and even now, this is huge. For years, we always theorized and kind of knew that the FNaF 2 minigame was the origin of the puppet, but to finally get that confirmed was just great. Not straying too far away from that is the infamous Later That Night minigame, which is still the biggest mystery in FNaF. What it all means is just so confusing and honestly just not fun to theorize about, since there's nothing clear as to what anything is. The only two things we know almost certainly happened is that this happens right after Charlotte's murder, and the orange man is William Afton. Why he's orange and not some shade of purple is beyond me though. Everything else is just so confusing and random, it's just not interesting to me. What is Junior's? What is the mound in the woods? Who's in the house? Who ran off to what place? Why are there giant rabbit footprints outside the house? Since there's nothing to go off of to even make a somewhat accurate theory, it's just all speculation and not even fun to try. And the fact that this is the final game makes it so much more frustrating. I know I said earlier that I like some things to remain unanswered or for the player to come to their own conclusions, but with this, things are so specific, you know they must mean something to the story. But it's the final game, so why is it trying to add more questions when we should be solely focused on answering and wrapping up loose ends of the story? Honestly, I think I could say Midnight Motorist is the worst FNaF minigame of the series, and it's easily the most confusing for the sake of being confusing. Fruity Maze is there too, and I guess it just kind of shows how William lured kids to the back to kill them, but okay, not really important stuff. However, even though I've been a little negative, I finally have to talk about the ending, and man, it's like so good. The whole thing was just a trap for anyone left to be burned and finally set free. Everyone left is Michael Afton, who we play as, William Afton, who is Springtrap, Elizabeth Afton, who is Baby, Ennard, who is now Molten Freddy, and Henry's daughter Charlotte, who is the puppet who is inside Lefty. And Henry's monologue, man, just goes so hard.
Connection terminated. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth, if you still even remember that name, but I'm afraid you've been misinformed. You are not here to receive a gift, nor have you been called here by the individual you assume, although you have indeed been called. You have all been called here, into a labyrinth of sounds and smells, misdirection, and misfortune. A labyrinth with no exit, a maze with no prize. You don't even realize that you are trapped. Your lust for blood has driven you in endless circles, chasing the cries of children in some unseen chamber, always seeming so near, yet somehow out of reach. But you will never find them. None of you will. This is where your story ends. And to you, my brave volunteer, who somehow found this job listing not intended for you. Although there was a way out planned for you, I have a feeling that's not what you want. I have a feeling that you are right where you want to be. I am remaining as well. I am nearby. This place will not be remembered, and the memory of everything that started this can finally begin to fade away, as the agony of every tragedy should. And to you monsters trapped in the corridors, be still, and give up your spirits. They don't belong to you. For most of you, I believe there is peace, and perhaps more, waiting for you after the smoke clears. Although for one of you, the darkest pit of hell has opened to swallow you whole, so don't keep the devil waiting, friend.
10 out of 10 dialogue right there. And that's pretty much it on Pizzeria Simulator. The ending and certain reveals were amazing, but the Midnight Motorist minigame comes close to tarnishing all of the great things about this game lore-wise. UCN is the final game I'll be talking about, and yeah, there's not really much to say about it. This is kind of just a final send-off to the original Scott Cawthon series of games. It has almost all of the characters, with some weird exclusions like Withered Freddy and Foxy, Nightmare Chica and Foxy, and Funtime Freddy. And this is basically designed to be the ultimate challenge. 50/20 mode is the main attraction here, and while I've obviously never beat it or even tried, it's great that it's possible to do and that people have. I remember being on the edge of my seat watching Doggo play it until he finally did, which was a moment of great achievement I think everyone in the community felt. The lore in this game is pretty much just the implications that the spirit of Golden Freddy is torturing William Afton in Purgatory, and honestly I'm all for it. It's something that can perfectly be without interfering with the rest of the story. It's also nice to see a lot of the original models for the animatronics from FNaF 1 through 4, before they were all replaced with crappy models in FNaF AR and Help Wanted. But even though the characters all might look great model-wise, the jump scares are just horrible. For some animatronics like Baby, the Mediocre Melodies, and the Rockstar animatronics, this is their first jump scare. But they all just suck, especially Baby's. She's just so lazy, and the fact that she didn't have one in her own game makes it worse. However, I get this is a huge game, and I'd rather have an actual functional game, even if it means sacrificing the jump scares. I have to say though, all the offices look great. The fact that there are multiple offices alone is a great inclusion that Scott didn't need to do. Also, not sure if this is a coincidence or not, but this is the 7th game in the series, and the 7th night is the custom night in the other games. It's a pretty cool detail, even if it's not intentional. But that's pretty much it. I don't really have a lot to say about UCN, other than it's just a cool send-off to the series. So now, after those games came out is when FNaF Help Wanted, FNaF AR, and Security Breach came out. And this is when I became uninterested in the series. Once things like Remnant, Glitch Trap, and the original games possibly being just games that aren't even canon anymore, I lost all interest at that point. I mean, especially the more sci-fi elements like Remnant and all the William Afton shenanigans, it all really just turned me off. I always liked that there's never seemingly a reason that William Afton killed other than him just being pure evil. So when it turns him into basically a mad scientist doing all this to experiment with the hopes of becoming immortal, that's just so lame and isn't even the same series I thought I knew. I just truly wish the series was rebooted at this point and created a new continuity instead of trying to grasp onto the old one. The original continuity and story was already finished and also had enough questions of its own to answer, let alone more from these new games. So for all those reasons, plus just me kind of growing up and just naturally growing out of FNaF, yeah, I can't really say I'm a fan of the series anymore. I am definitely nostalgic for it, but to say I'm a fan of it, nah. And with that, after almost a week of writing this, I can confidently say that I've finally said my piece about Five Nights at Freddy's. I originally wrote this and posted it on the FNaF Amino, but since it was super long, I figured I'd just record a video for it so that it's way easier to digest. Finally, I just want to take some time to shout out some people that without them, this whole thing wouldn't be possible. I want to thank the many YouTubers over the years who have covered this series and gameplays, theories, and just videos about the games. Some in particular I like to thank are Dawko, Game Theory, Markiplier, Resbowski, 8-Bit Gaming, Fugency Gamer, Zombie Wars SMT, Completionist, and yeah. Finally, and most importantly, I want to thank Scott Cawthon himself for making these games and the series as a whole. So thank you, Scott, for these games, your time dedicated to the series and the fans, and giving me and so many others memories I will always